Picture a little girl standing at the top of a grand staircase in one of the wealthiest homes in New York City, watching her own mother look up at her with open disappointment, and hearing that mother turn to a house guest and say, right in front of the child, that this daughter was so serious and so plain that the family had taken to calling her Granny instead of by her actual name. Mysterious tone. That little girl was Eleanor Roosevelt, a child born into more money and more social standing than almost anyone else in America, and yet a child who spent her entire early life believing, in the deepest part of herself, that she was fundamentally unlovable. A belief so deeply rooted that it would take her decades of hard-won public achievement, and a great deal of private struggle to even begin to genuinely question it. And somehow, from that lonely, unwanted little girl, grew a woman who would go on to redefine what an American First Lady could be, who would stand up to presidents and dictators alike, and who would eventually help write the single most influential document about basic human dignity that the entire world has ever produced. Before we go any further, comment down below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. And while you're there, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Because the story of Eleanor Roosevelt is one of the most remarkable transformations from private pain into public power in all of American history. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Shocking fact tone. Eleanor Roosevelt was orphaned by the age of 10. Her mother was dead. Her father, the man she loved more than anyone else on earth, was dead too, and he died in circumstances so painful and so surrounded by shame that for years afterward, hardly anyone in her family wanted to speak his name out loud in front of her. By almost any measure you could apply, Eleanor Roosevelt should have grown into a quiet, damaged, invisible woman, someone crushed by grief and neglect long before she ever had the chance to matter to anyone beyond her own small, sad household. Bold statement tone. Instead, this woman became, in the words of President Harry Truman himself, the First Lady of the world. A woman so widely admired by the time of her death that a Gallup poll would later name her the most admired person of the entire 20th century. A distinction earned not through inherited privilege alone, but through decades of relentless, deliberate, and often genuinely lonely work to transform herself from an unwanted child into a woman whose voice could move presidents, kings, and entire nations, proof, if any were still needed, that the deepest childhood wounds do not have to determine the entire shape of a life, even when, as in Eleanor's case, they never fully disappear. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born on the 11th of October in the year 1884 into a family so wealthy and so socially prominent that New York newspapers of the era had a specific slang term for people like them. They were called the swells, families whose money stretched back for generations, whose names appeared constantly in the society pages, and whose children were raised from birth with the expectation that they would marry well, host elegant parties, and quietly maintain the family's standing at the very top of American high society. A world of private tutors, summer estates, and servants who managed nearly every practical detail of daily life so thoroughly that a child growing up inside it might never once need to learn how to do. Something so basic as cook her own meal or manage her own household budget, a cushioned, insulated existence that Eleanor herself would later come to view with a certain uneasy ambivalence once she began, as a young woman, encountering firsthand the vastly different circumstances in which most other Americans actually lived. Reflective tone. It is worth understanding just how much privilege surrounded Eleanor from the very moment she was born, because her story is not, in any simple sense, a rags-to-riches tale. She never knew poverty. she never wanted for food, clothing, or education. And yet all of that material comfort turned out to matter far less to her actual childhood happiness than the emotional wreckage happening quietly behind the closed doors of her family's beautiful homes. A lesson about the limits of wealth that would eventually shape her entire adult understanding of what genuine human need actually looked like. A lesson no amount of inherited money could have taught her on its own. Her father, a man named Eleanor Roosevelt, was the younger brother of a rising young politician named Theodore Roosevelt, the very man who would go on to become the 26th President of the United States. Eliot was, by every account that survives him, a genuinely charming, warm, and affectionate man. The kind of father who lit up whenever his little daughter entered the room, who called her by pet names, who seemed to see something in her that almost no one else in the family ever bothered to notice. A father who nicknamed her Little Nell and wrote her tender letters filled with the kind of easy affection she received from almost nobody else in her young life. Letters she reportedly kept and reread for years afterward. Treasured fragments of a warmth she otherwise had to piece together almost entirely from memory once he was gone. Vulnerability tone. Eleanor adored him completely, and this adoration is perhaps the single most important emotional fact of her entire childhood. Because Eleanor Roosevelt was also, tragically, a severe alcoholic. A man whose addiction grew steadily worse throughout Eleanor's early years, eventually spiraling into violent rages, extended absences, and a pattern of behavior so destructive that his own brother Theodore, horrified by what alcoholism was doing to their family's reputation and to Eliot's own health, eventually helped arrange for him to be confined, for a period, to a sanatorium. A painful and humiliating intervention that permanently damaged the relationship between the two once close brothers, even as it did little to actually cure Eliot of the addiction slowly destroying him. A family tragedy playing out largely behind closed doors, even as Theodore's own political star rose steadily in full public view. Mini-story tone. There is one memory from this period that Eleanor herself recorded and returned to throughout her life. A memory that captures, in a single devastating image, exactly what it felt like to be her father's daughter during these years. She once waited for hours outside her father's private club in New York. A small girl standing patiently on the sidewalk in her good dress, certain that if she simply waited long enough, he would finally come out and take her somewhere wonderful the way he always promised. Rehearsing in her head the stories she wanted to tell him about her week. The small triumphs and questions she had been saving up specifically to share with the one adult in her life who actually seemed to want to hear them. Instead, when the doors of the club finally opened, she watched as her own father was carried out by the staff, completely unconscious from drinking, unable even to recognize that his own daughter was standing right there, watching the whole humiliating scene unfold. Reflective tone. It is hard to imagine a more painful early lesson in the gap between the love someone promises you and the love they are actually capable of delivering. And this particular wound, the ache of loving a parent who could never quite show up for her, would echo through the rest of Eleanor's life, in ways she herself would spend decades trying to understand, resurfacing at unexpected moments long after she had become a grown woman with children and grandchildren of her own. A wound that time softened, but never entirely closed. Her mother, meanwhile, offered a different but equally painful kind of absence. Anna Hall Roosevelt was, by the standards of her era, a celebrated beauty. A woman whose looks had been remarked upon since her own girlhood, and she seems to have found her small, serious, rather solemn daughter genuinely difficult to warm to. A mismatch between mother and child that neither of them, trapped inside the rigid expectations of their social class, ever quite found a way to bridge. A distance that only widened as Eleanor grew older and began to understand, with a child's painful clarity, exactly how her mother's affections were being distributed within their own household, and how rarely any meaningful share of that affection seemed to flow in her own direction. Vulnerability tone. Contemporary accounts describe Anna as emotionally distant, someone who found Eleanor's plainness almost embarrassing, and who nicknamed her own daughter Granny specifically because the child seemed, even at a very young age, so grave and so old-fashioned in her manner, an unmistakable jab dressed up as an affectionate family nickname. The kind of casual cruelty that could pass entirely unremarked upon within a family, and yet leave permanent marks on the child forced to carry it. Bold statement tone. Try to imagine what it does to a small child to grow up understanding, with total clarity, that her own mother finds her looks disappointing enough to comment on it openly, in front of other adults, as though the child herself were not even fully present in the room to hear it. This is precisely the kind of quiet, corrosive damage that shaped Eleanor's earliest sense of her own worth, a conviction that she was simply not the kind of girl anyone could love easily, a belief that would take her decades of hard, deliberate work to even partially unlearn, one that would echo in subtle ways through her relationships with her own children, and eventually through the fierce, almost compulsive drive she brought to her later public service, as though proving her worth to a world beyond her own family might finally settle a question her mother had left permanently, painfully open. The blows kept coming. In December of 1892, when Eleanor was only 8 years old, her mother died suddenly of diphtheria, a devastating infectious illness that swept through the household following a surgical operation intended to treat her. And that claimed, only months later, the life of Eleanor's younger brother as well, after both surviving children contracted scarlet fever in the aftermath of their mother's death, and only one of them, her brother Hall, managed to recover, leaving the family reeling from 2 funerals within a single grief-stricken year. Urgent tone. Within the span of less than a year, Eleanor had lost her mother and one of her 2 brothers, and her father, already unstable and increasingly dependent on alcohol to manage his own grief, was simply not equipped to step in and hold what remained of the family together. Eleanor and her surviving younger brother, a boy named Hall, were sent to live with their maternal grandmother, a stern, conservative woman named Mary Hall, in a large but emotionally cold house in Manhattan, and later at the family's country estate in Tivoli, New York. A household that Eleanor herself would later describe as run according to rigid, old-fashioned rules that left little room for the ordinary warmth or spontaneity a grieving child might otherwise have needed. Meals eaten largely in silence, days structured around strict routines of lessons and quiet solitary play, rather than the noisy, affectionate chaos of an ordinary childhood. Reflective tone. Eleanor's relationship with her father did not end entirely during this period, but it narrowed into something painfully thin, occasional visits and letters rather than the daily presence a grieving child desperately needed, since the adults around her had largely decided, for reasons they believed were protective, to limit how much time the unstable, increasingly erratic Elliot actually spent with his own daughter. A decision that, however well-intentioned, left Eleanor waiting, again and again, for a father who came to represent both her greatest source of love and her greatest source of disappointment. On the 14th of August, in the year 1894, Eleanor Roosevelt died. Vulnerability tone. Eleanor was not yet 10 years old, and the man whose love had meant more to her than anyone else's on earth, the one parent who had ever made her feel genuinely, unconditionally cherished, was simply gone, his death the direct and tragic consequence of the very addiction that had already stolen so many years of real closeness between them while he was still alive. Bold statement tone. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of loss this child had absorbed by the time she was barely 10 years old. Both parents dead. A brother dead. Raised now by a grandmother whose own approach to child-rearing tended toward rigid discipline rather than warmth. In a household further complicated by a pair of unmarried uncles living under the same roof whose own struggles with alcohol echoed uncomfortably, the very pattern that had destroyed her father. Uncles whose own occasional violent outbursts and unpredictable moods added yet another layer of quiet, ever-present anxiety to a household that already offered a grieving child very little in the way of genuine stability or comfort. A domestic atmosphere Eleanor herself later described with a kind of careful, restrained sadness rather than open bitterness. This was the emotional inheritance Eleanor Roosevelt carried with her into adolescence. A girl old enough to understand exactly what she had lost, and young enough that the loss would shape absolutely everything that came afterward. One steady, genuinely warm presence did exist in Eleanor's life during these difficult years, though it came from an unexpected direction. Reflective tone. Her uncle Theodore, her father's older and considerably more disciplined brother, regularly welcomed Eleanor to Sagamore Hill, his own family's Long Island estate, where she played alongside her cousins. Learned to swim under her uncle's own patient instruction, joined in pillow fights and long afternoon hikes through the surrounding woods, and absorbed, whether she fully recognized it at the time or not, an entirely different model of what a Roosevelt could actually become. A model built not around personal indulgence, but around vigorous engagement with the wider world and a genuine sense of public duty. This could imply, based on how directly Eleanor's own later career mirrored the reform-minded, socially conscious politics her uncle championed throughout his own public life, that these childhood visits planted a seed that would not fully flower for another 2 decades. A growing conviction that people of wealth and privilege carried a genuine obligation to improve the lives of those who had neither. By the time Eleanor returned from her schooling in England in 1902, her uncle Theodore had become President of the United States, and her cousin Alice, once simply her childhood playmate at Sagamore Hill, had become one of the most famous young women in the entire country, a celebrated society darling whose every outfit and opinion seemed to make national headlines. A strange, almost dizzying family backdrop against which Eleanor's own far quieter, more uncertain path toward adulthood was unfolding, largely unnoticed by a press and a public far more interested in her glamorous cousin. It was against this bleak emotional backdrop that a single decision, made almost as an afterthought by a worried grandmother concerned about a teenage girl living in a household full of unstable adult men, would end up changing the entire trajectory of Eleanor's life. Reflective tone. In 1899, when Eleanor was 15 years old, her grandmother made the decision to send her across the ocean to a girls' boarding school just outside London called Allenswood Academy. A decision driven at least as much by simple practical concern for the girl's safety and supervision as by any grand educational ambition, since the household in Tivoli had grown increasingly unsuitable for a teenage girl. Its unmarried adult men struggling with their own drinking problems in ways that echoed uncomfortably close to the very pattern that had destroyed Eleanor's own father. Shocking fact tone. Nothing could have prepared anyone in Eleanor's family for what actually happened to her once she arrived there. The school's headmistress, a formidable French woman named Marie Souvestre, took one look at this quiet, insecure, painfully shy American girl and saw something almost nobody else in Eleanor's entire life up to that point had bothered to look for: genuine intellectual promise. Sylvestra was, by every surviving account, a woman of enormous personal magnetism and fierce intelligence. A progressive educator who believed passionately in encouraging young women to think independently, to travel, to engage seriously with literature, history, and philosophy rather than simply preparing themselves to be decorative wives. She had already, by the time Eleanor arrived at her school, built a considerable reputation across Europe for producing graduates who went on to lead unusually independent, intellectually engaged lives. And she took a particular, almost immediate interest in this quiet American girl who sat at the edge of every classroom discussion, clearly absorbing everything but rarely daring to speak up herself. Bold statement tone. Eleanor threw herself into this new world with a hunger that surprised everyone who had known her back in New York as the awkward, withdrawn granny of her mother's cruel nickname. She excelled academically, mastering French to the point of near fluency, immersing herself in history and literature with a genuine intellectual curiosity that no tutor back home had ever managed to draw out of her, discovering in the process a real pleasure in debate and discussion that stood in complete contrast to the quiet, deferential role she had always been expected to play within her own family. A young woman finding, almost for the first time, that her own opinions were not merely tolerated, but genuinely welcomed and encouraged. She traveled through France and Italy during school holidays, often accompanying Sylvestra herself on these trips, absorbing art, architecture, and ideas with the kind of eager attention that only someone who has been starved of genuine intellectual engagement can bring to a sudden feast of it. Sylvestra taking the time during these journeys to personally tutor Eleanor on subjects the school's formal curriculum did not even offer. Vulnerability tone. Eleanor herself would later describe her 3 years at Allenswood as the happiest of her entire life, a striking and genuinely poignant admission from a woman whose adult years would eventually include a role at the very center of world history, suggesting just how profoundly starved she had been, before this point, for even the most basic experience of being truly seen and valued by another adult, and how completely those 3 years spent under Sylvestra's watchful, encouraging attention managed to fill a hole that a decade of loss and quiet neglect had carved into her. Reluctantly, painfully, Eleanor returned to New York in the summer of 1902 to make her formal debut into society, the elaborate ritual by which wealthy young women of her era were formally presented as eligible for marriage. A ritual involving an exhausting round of parties, teas, and carefully orchestrated public appearances designed to showcase a young woman's suitability as a future wife to the eligible bachelors of her social class. This could imply, based on how consistently Eleanor herself described dreading this return, that she understood, even at 17 years old, that the confident, intellectually engaged young woman Sylvestra had helped her become sat uneasily alongside the narrow, decorative role New York society expected her to step back into. A young woman who had spent 3 years being encouraged to think for herself, now facing a world that mostly wanted her to smile, dance, and wait quietly to be chosen. Rather than simply settling into the empty social whirl of parties and calling cards that consumed most debutantes of her class, Eleanor threw herself into volunteer work, joining the Junior League and teaching immigrant children at a settlement house on Rivington Street on Manhattan's Lower East Side, work that exposed her, often for the very first time in her sheltered life, to the genuine desperation of urban poverty existing only a few miles from her own family's comfortable townhouses. Mini story tone. Picture the scene of this young woman, raised in a world of servants and private carriages, stepping for the first time into a crowded tenement classroom filled with the children of recent immigrants, many of whom had never before encountered a member of New York's wealthy elite, treating them with anything resembling genuine respect and attention. Patiently teaching lessons in a room heated poorly against the winter cold, surrounded by children whose own daily lives bore almost no resemblance to the sheltered comfort she herself had always known. She also became a volunteer investigator for the National Consumers League, touring the sweatshops and tenement apartments where many of New York's poorest workers labored and lived. Documenting unsafe and unsanitary conditions in reports meant to pressure lawmakers into passing genuine labor reforms. Work that required her to climb narrow, poorly lit tenement staircases and witness firsthand the kind of overcrowding, disease, and exhausting labor that her own family's wealth had always kept safely out of view. The smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies crowded into single rooms, children coughing from illnesses that better ventilation and basic sanitation could easily have prevented. Images that lodged themselves permanently in Eleanor's memory and that she would return to again and again throughout the rest of her public life whenever she needed to explain to skeptical audiences of her own social class exactly why economic reform actually mattered. It was during this same period, in her debutante year, that Eleanor's life took the turn that would define the rest of it. Mini-story tone. During a train ride back to the Roosevelt family's estate in the Hudson Valley, Eleanor found herself sharing a car with a distant cousin, a tall, charming, athletically built young man attending Harvard University named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A young man whose confident, easy charm stood in almost total contrast to Eleanor's own careful reserve, yet who found himself genuinely drawn into conversation with this serious, thoughtful young woman in a way he apparently had not expected. The two of them talked for the entire journey, a conversation substantial and genuinely engaging enough that it sparked something between them neither had quite expected. Eleanor discovering, perhaps for the first time since her years at Allenswood, a companion who seemed genuinely interested in her actual thoughts rather than merely her family connections or her prospects as a wife. Reflective tone. Franklin was Eleanor's fifth cousin once removed, a connection distant enough by the standards of the time not to raise serious concern, though it would later provide plenty of material for jokes among their extended family, including from Eleanor's own uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt himself, who reportedly remarked, upon hearing of their engagement, that it was a good thing to keep the name in the family, a light-hearted comment that nonetheless captured something genuinely true about the close, interconnected world of old New York families in which both Eleanor and Franklin had grown up. A world small enough that even a marriage between two people carrying the same famous surname seemed, to nearly everyone involved, entirely unremarkable. The courtship that followed unfolded largely in secret, partly because Franklin's formidable mother, a woman named Sarah Delano Roosevelt, believed the young couple far too immature to seriously consider marriage and hoped that time and distance might cool the romance before it went any further, a hope that revealed, even at this early stage, exactly the kind of possessive, controlling relationship Sarah maintained with her only child, a relationship that would go on to shape the entire early architecture of Eleanor and Franklin's marriage in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated on the day of their secret engagement. Bold statement tone. Sarah's opposition proved no match for her son's determination, and in November of 1903, Franklin and Eleanor became formally engaged, though at Sarah's insistence, the engagement was kept secret from the wider public for nearly a year, in the private hope that time and distance might yet cool her son's affections. On the 17th of March, in the year 1905, the two were married in a ceremony at the New York home of one of Eleanor's relatives. The wedding, officiated by Endicott Peabody, the headmaster of the elite Groton School Franklin himself, had once attended, and in a detail that generated considerable newspaper attention at the time. It was Eleanor's own uncle, the sitting president of the United States, who walked her down the aisle and gave her away. His presence at the wedding treated as front-page news across the country. Mini-story tone. Picture the scene inside that crowded New York townhouse, the ceremony itself nearly drowned out by an ancient order of Hibernians parade marching past outside in celebration of St. Patrick's Day. The very date on which the wedding happened to fall, guests craning their necks not toward the bride and groom exchanging their vows, but toward the unmistakable, booming presence of Theodore Roosevelt himself, a man whose sheer charisma and fame could apparently dominate a room even when he was ostensibly there only as a supporting player in someone else's wedding. His laughter and his handshake apparently far more magnetic to the assembled guests than the quiet, solemn young couple actually exchanging their vows that afternoon. Shocking fact tone. Guests at the wedding later recalled that so many people crowded around President Roosevelt after the ceremony, eager simply to shake his hand and exchange a few words, that the bride and groom themselves were left standing largely forgotten in a side room, an oddly fitting metaphor, in hindsight, for the way Eleanor's own considerable achievements would spend much of the following decades being overshadowed by the more immediately visible Roosevelt men in her life. Eleanor was 20 years old on her wedding day. Franklin was 22, and the two of them settled first into a New York City residence that Franklin's mother had selected and furnished entirely according to her own taste, down to the placement of the furniture and the choice of household staff, leaving the young bride with almost no say whatsoever in how her own first home would actually look or function, and later into a second home on the family's Hyde Park estate overlooking the Hudson River, a property that likewise remained, in every meaningful sense, Sarah's own domain, rather than genuinely belonging to the young couple who nominally lived there. Reflective tone. This pattern of Sarah Delano Roosevelt's overwhelming presence in the young couple's life would define the entire early years of Eleanor's marriage in ways that proved genuinely difficult for her to navigate. Sarah eventually purchased 2 connected townhouses in Manhattan specifically, so that she could move freely between her own home and her son's family, cutting doors directly between the buildings so that she could, quite literally, walk in on her son and daughter-in-law at any moment she chose, without so much as knocking. Vulnerability tone. Eleanor had genuinely hoped, arriving into this marriage as a young woman who had lost her own mother so many years earlier, that Sarah might come to fill something of that missing maternal role in her life. Instead, she found herself dominated by a mother-in-law who controlled the household staff, dictated the children's upbringing, and left Eleanor feeling, by her own later account, less like the mistress of her own home than like an unusually privileged guest living under someone else's roof. The Roosevelt children themselves quickly learned that their grandmother, unlike their own frequently overwhelmed mother, would almost never say no to them, and they took full advantage of this dynamic, running to Sarah whenever their parents denied them something. A pattern that further undermined whatever authority Eleanor might otherwise have exercised as a young mother still finding her own footing. Between 1906 and 1916, Eleanor gave birth to 6 children, a daughter named Anna, followed by 5 sons, one of whom, a first Franklin Jr., died in infancy after only a few months of life. A loss that plunged Eleanor into a grief made only more isolating by Sarah's continued, overwhelming presence in every aspect of the children's care. James arrived in 1907, Elliot in 1910, and after the devastating loss of the first Franklin Jr., a second son given the same name in 1914, and finally John in 1916, meaning Eleanor spent essentially the entire decade of her 20s either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or caring for infants, all while navigating a mother-in-law who second-guessed nearly every parenting decision she attempted to make on her own. Bold statement tone. It is worth pausing here to really sit with just how physically and emotionally consuming this decade of Eleanor's life actually was. 6 pregnancies across 10 years, the devastating loss of an infant son, all while living under the constant, watchful supervision of a mother-in-law who made Eleanor feel, by her own later admission, like an inadequate substitute mother in her own children's lives rather than their primary parent. This could imply, based on Eleanor's own later account of feeling like little more than an unusually privileged guest in her own household, that Sarah's dominance extended well beyond mere furniture and staffing decisions into the far more sensitive territory of parenting itself. The Roosevelt children quickly learning that their indulgent grandmother would rarely say no to them, and running to her whenever their own mother or father denied them something. A pattern that only deepened Eleanor's growing sense that her own authority as a mother counted for remarkably little inside the very house she was supposed to be running. Franklin's own political career, meanwhile, was steadily gathering momentum. In 1910, he won election to the New York State Senate, and the family relocated to Albany, where Eleanor found herself thrust, for the very first time, into the world of practical day-to-day political life, watching her husband navigate the corrupt machinery of Tammany Hall politics up close, learning firsthand exactly how legislative deals were struck, how alliances were built and broken, and how a young, ambitious politician needed to balance genuine reform ideals against the messy, transactional realities of actually getting anything passed into law. Lessons Eleanor absorbed quietly from the sidelines during these Albany years that would prove, decades later, unexpectedly useful once she herself began navigating the equally complicated, equally transactional world of Washington politics in her own right. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson appointed Franklin as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a position that placed the young politician at the center of Washington's official social and political life. And the family moved once again, this time to Washington, D.C., where Eleanor's political education continued to deepen, even as she spent a considerable portion of her time fulfilling the largely ceremonial, socially exhausting obligations expected of a rising official's wife. Endless formal calls and dinners that she herself frequently described, in later years as tedious in the extreme, an unending circuit of visiting cards and social obligations that consumed hours of her day without ever engaging her mind or her genuine interests in any meaningful way. Hours she would later come to view, once her own public career finally began in earnest, as a genuinely wasted apprenticeship in the kind of decorative femininity she had spent her entire adolescence at Allenswood learning to see beyond. Reflective tone. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, something genuinely important shifted in Eleanor's own sense of herself. She threw herself into volunteer work with an intensity that surprised even her own family, visiting wounded soldiers in military hospitals, walking miles of hospital corridors to sit with young men who had returned from the battlefields of Europe, missing limbs or suffering from injuries and trauma that the medicine of the era could barely begin to treat, working long, exhausting shifts serving coffee and sandwiches to servicemen passing through Washington's train stations at a Red Cross canteen, and organizing volunteer networks with a skill for leadership and administration that had, until this point, remained largely untested and unnoticed even by Eleanor herself. She oversaw the operations of the Red Cross canteen with a thoroughness that impressed even the professional staff working alongside her, tracking supplies, coordinating shifts among dozens of other volunteer women, and ensuring that soldiers passing through the station, sometimes at all hours of the night, always found something warm waiting for them. Vulnerability tone. She would later write, with evident and genuine surprise at her own reaction, that she loved this work, that she simply ate it up, a woman discovering, for what felt like the first time in her adult life, that she possessed real capabilities beyond the narrow roles of wife, mother, and dutiful political hostess that her marriage and her social class had assigned to her. A discovery that felt, by her own later description, almost like waking up after years of half sleepwalking through a life that had never quite fit her. And then, in September of 1918, everything changed. Urgent tone. Franklin had spent the previous months on an extended tour of Europe, inspecting naval operations, supporting the war effort, and when he finally returned home, he was gravely ill with pneumonia, so weak that sailors had to physically carry him off the ship and into the family's Manhattan townhouse. His condition serious enough that for a time the family genuinely feared for his life. As the dutiful wife, it fell to Eleanor to unpack her husband's luggage while he recovered in bed upstairs. A mundane, ordinary domestic task that would end up permanently altering the entire course of her life. And inside one of his suitcases, tucked among his clothing, she found a small packet of letters that would shatter, in an instant, whatever illusions she had maintained about the true state of her marriage. Shocking fact tone. The letters were love letters, written by a woman named Lucy Mercer, the very woman Eleanor herself had hired years earlier to serve as her own social secretary. A bright, warm, attractive young woman from a socially prominent but financially struggling Washington family who had become, over the preceding 2 years, considerably more than a household employee to Eleanor's husband. Eleanor had hired Lucy back in 1914, when the demands of managing the busy social calendar expected of an assistant naval secretary's wife had simply grown too much for her to handle alone. And Lucy quickly proved herself not merely competent, but genuinely likable, charming Eleanor's own children, and, by every account, becoming a warm and welcome presence throughout the Roosevelt household, invited to family dinners and included in casual gatherings as though she were less an employee than a genuine friend. Exactly the kind of trusted intimacy that made the eventual betrayal all the more devastating once its true nature finally came to light. Bold statement tone. Try to imagine the particular specific cruelty of this discovery. Not simply infidelity, painful enough on its own terms, but infidelity with a woman Eleanor had personally invited into her own household, a woman who had helped care for her children, who had charmed her own family, whom Eleanor had genuinely liked and trusted. A betrayal that struck not only at her marriage, but at her own judgment, her own sense of who she could safely open her home and her heart to. Reflective tone. The affair, historians studying the surviving correspondence and testimony from those close to the family generally agree, had likely begun sometime around 1916, blossoming during a period when Eleanor and the children were away at the family's summer home on Campobello Island, while Franklin remained behind in the sweltering heat of wartime Washington, ostensibly detained by the pressing demands of his naval duties, but evidently also enjoying considerably more of Lucy Mercer's company than his wife back in Maine could have possibly imagined at the time, including regular yachting parties on the Potomac River that Franklin himself later described to Eleanor in cheerfully innocent letters. Apparently confident enough in his own discretion that he saw no danger in mentioning these outings directly to his wife. In 1917, Eleanor, sensing something was amiss but unable to fully articulate her growing unease, had grown reluctant to leave for Campobello at all that summer, and when she finally did depart, she wrote to Franklin, expressing a raw, unmistakable sense of her own unwantedness. A letter to which Franklin responded with reassurances that she was, in his words, a goosey girl to doubt his affection, urging her to stay away the full 6 weeks rather than cutting her visit short to return to him. A reassurance that, in hindsight, reads far less innocently than Franklin surely intended it at the time. Eleanor, devastated and humiliated, offered her husband a divorce. This could imply, based on the sheer directness of this offer from a woman raised in an era when divorce carried enormous social stigma, particularly for women, that the betrayal had cut deep enough to override even Eleanor's considerable concern for social respectability and her children's future. A genuinely radical step for a woman of her class and generation to even contemplate, let alone actually propose to her own husband in the raw aftermath of discovering his infidelity. Urgent tone. What followed was a swift, decisive intervention from the two people who understood most clearly exactly what a Roosevelt divorce would cost. Franklin's own formidable mother, Sarah, and his closest political advisor, a shrewd, devoted operative named Louis Howe, who had already begun quietly grooming Franklin for a political future considerably larger than a mere naval sub-cabinet post. A small, unglamorous, chain-smoking newspaperman who had attached himself to Franklin's career years earlier and who saw in the young politician exactly the kind of raw talent worth investing. His own career in cultivating a partnership between Howe and the Roosevelts that would eventually prove instrumental not only to Franklin's own political recovery, but, in time, to Eleanor's independent political education as well, since Howe recognized in her a genuine talent that few others around her had yet bothered to notice or encourage. Sarah made her position unmistakably clear, threatening to cut her son off entirely from the substantial Roosevelt family fortune he depended upon if he proceeded with a divorce that would, in her mind, permanently destroy both the family's social standing and Franklin's entire political future, in an era when divorced men simply did not get elected to high office in America. Lucy Mercer's own Catholic faith, which considered marriage to a divorced man simply out of the question, closed off whatever alternative future the couple might otherwise have pursued together. A detail that some biographers believe weighed just as heavily in the eventual outcome as any threat from Sarah, or any calculation about political ambition. Franklin chose to stay married, and Eleanor, weighing her own limited options as a mother of 5 surviving children with no independent income of her own, and acutely aware of exactly how little practical freedom a woman in her position actually possessed to simply walk away and build an entirely separate life, agreed to remain in the marriage as well, but only after extracting from her husband an explicit, direct promise that he would never see Lucy Mercer again. A promise Franklin would make sincerely enough in that moment, even if the passing years would eventually reveal just how imperfectly he actually kept it. Reflective tone. It is important to understand, looking back at this moment with the full weight of everything Eleanor would go on to accomplish over the following 4 decades, that this was not simply a private domestic drama playing out behind closed doors. This was the precise moment at which the entire architecture of the Roosevelt marriage was permanently rebuilt, transformed from something resembling an ordinary, if increasingly distant, romantic partnership into an entirely different kind of arrangement. A genuine political and public partnership between two people who would remain, for the rest of their lives, affectionate and mutually devoted allies, but who would, as Eleanor herself put it decades later, in words that have become one of her most quoted lines: "Never fully forget what had happened between them." She would later write, with characteristic bluntness, that she possessed the memory of an elephant, that she could forgive, but she could never entirely forget. A phrase that captures with remarkable economy exactly the complicated, permanently altered nature of the bond that remained between her and Franklin for the rest of both their lives. A marriage that would go on to accomplish extraordinary things together while never again resembling, in its most intimate dimensions, what it had once been. Bold statement tone. Whatever devastation this discovery caused Eleanor in the moment, and by every account it caused a great deal, historians looking back at the full sweep of her life have consistently identified 1918 as the true turning point of her entire biography, the moment at which the shy, insecure young political wife began, deliberately and with real determination, to build an identity, a set of interests, and eventually an entire public career that belonged to her alone, entirely separate from her role as Franklin's wife. She began expanding her own circle of friends and colleagues well beyond the narrow social world Franklin and his mother had constructed around her, cultivating friendships with politically engaged, professionally accomplished women who took her seriously as a thinker and an organizer in her own right, rather than merely as a convenient extension of her husband's ambitions. She joined the Women's Trade Union League, an organization advocating for the rights and safety of female factory workers, spending time alongside working-class women whose daily struggles bore no resemblance whatsoever to the sheltered world she herself had grown up in, and became increasingly active in New York's Democratic Party politics, developing her own independent political relationships and her own genuine expertise entirely apart from whatever influence came simply from being Franklin Roosevelt's wife. Learning the practical mechanics of organizing precincts, drafting political literature, and building coalitions among women voters who had only just, in 1920, won the constitutional right to cast a ballot at all. A newly enfranchised population of voters that savvy political organizers like Eleanor quickly recognized represented an enormous, largely untapped source of political energy waiting to be properly organized and mobilized. Vulnerability tone. And then, in the summer of 1921, just as this newly independent, increasingly confident version of Eleanor Roosevelt was beginning to take shape, catastrophe struck the family once again, though this time in a form that would, paradoxically, end up drawing Eleanor and Franklin's political fates together more tightly than ever before. While vacationing at the family's beloved retreat on Campobello Island, Franklin took the family sailing on his small boat, and within days of that seemingly ordinary summer outing, fell suddenly and severely ill, stricken with what doctors would eventually diagnose as poliomyelitis, a viral disease that swept through his body with terrifying speed, leaving the previously vigorous, athletic 39-year-old politician almost entirely paralyzed from the waist down within the span of little more than a week. A dizzying, almost incomprehensible reversal of fortune for a man who had spent his entire adult life defined by physical vigor and easy athletic confidence. Urgent tone. The following weeks and months tested Eleanor in ways that nothing in her difficult childhood or her complicated marriage had ever quite prepared her for. She nursed her husband through the acute, agonizing early stages of the illness personally, bathing him, shaving him, feeding him, brushing his teeth, and administering the enemas required to relieve his blocked and paralyzed bowels. Managing the humiliating physical realities of his sudden and total loss of bodily independence with a steady, uncomplaining devotion that would have surprised almost everyone who had known her only as the socially awkward young debutante of 2 decades earlier, sleeping on a cot beside his bed for weeks so that she could tend to him through the night whenever the pain or fear became too much for him to bear alone. Managing at the same time the practical demands of running a large household and caring for 5 children, all while absorbing, largely in private, her own considerable fear about what this sudden, catastrophic illness might ultimately mean for her husband's survival, let alone his future in public life. Reflective tone. Sarah Delano Roosevelt, watching her son's political dreams seemingly collapse along with his physical health, urged Franklin to abandon public life entirely and retreat into a quiet, protected existence as a wealthy invalid at the family estate, arguing that a man who could no longer walk into a room under his own power had no business trying to convince voters he was fit to lead them. Eleanor, remarkably, argued for the exact opposite course. Bold statement tone. She believed, with a conviction that would prove entirely correct, that her husband's political career, and indeed his entire sense of purpose and identity, needed to continue, whatever the physical obstacles now standing in his way, and she threw herself into the practical work of keeping Franklin's name and his political relationships alive throughout the long, difficult years of his partial recovery, giving speeches on his behalf, attending political functions he could not yet manage himself, and gradually developing, in the process, her own genuine talent for public speaking and political organizing that neither she nor anyone else in her family had ever fully anticipated she possessed. Working closely alongside Lewis Howe, who coached her patiently through her early, nervous public appearances, teaching her to slow her speech, to lower the nervous, high-pitched laugh that had once undercut her credibility whenever she grew anxious in front of a crowd, drilling her on how to project her voice to the back of a crowded hall, and how to organize her thoughts into the kind of clear, memorable points that ordinary voters could actually carry away with them. Patient, unglamorous coaching sessions that gradually transformed a woman who had once dreaded public speaking into one of the most effective political communicators of her entire generation. A transformation that neither Howe nor Eleanor herself could have fully predicted at the outset of these long, often tedious practice sessions, but one that would eventually reshape the entire course of American public life, laying the groundwork, quietly and unglamorously, for a public career that neither of them could have fully imagined in these early, uncertain years of Franklin's slow and painful recovery. What began as an act of loyal wifely support during her husband's darkest personal crisis would, within less than a decade, transform Eleanor Roosevelt from a woman known primarily for surviving a painful betrayal into one of the most consequential political figures American history had yet produced. A transformation that was only just beginning, and that would carry her, in the years immediately ahead, from the private grief of a broken marriage and a paralyzed husband toward a public stage, larger than either of them could have possibly imagined on that devastating night in 1918, when she first opened a small packet of another woman's letters. Through the remainder of the 1920s, as Franklin worked patiently to regain whatever physical strength his body would ultimately allow him to recover, Eleanor built an entire independent professional life that stood on its own merits, separate from anything connected to her husband's name. Bold statement tone. She helped establish Val-Kill Industries, a small non-profit furniture factory on the grounds of the family's Hyde Park estate, designed specifically to provide meaningful employment for rural workers in the surrounding community during years when the local farm economy was struggling. Producing handcrafted reproductions of early American furniture that Eleanor herself helped market and sell. A genuinely hands-on business venture entirely separate from any project connected to her husband's own political career. one she visited personally and often, learning the practical craft of woodworking alongside the very employees whose livelihoods the small factory was meant to support. She began teaching history, literature, and government at the Todhunter School, a private girls' school in Manhattan that she and two close friends eventually purchased outright, throwing herself into lesson preparation with the same intensity she brought to everything else, determined to give her students the kind of genuinely engaging, intellectually serious education that Marie Souvestre had once given her. Students who often arrived expecting the standard finishing school curriculum of etiquette and light accomplishment, and instead found themselves debating current political events and studying labor conditions alongside their more conventional coursework. Reflective tone. Eleanor also became a part owner of the school itself, and by every account from former students, she proved to be a genuinely gifted teacher, someone who brought current events and real-world political engagement directly into her classroom rather than relying on dry textbook recitation. Often arriving to teach fresh from a political meeting or a visit to a labor demonstration, still carrying the immediate, lived texture of the outside world into a classroom that most society girls of her students' background would otherwise have experienced as hopelessly sheltered from it. Commuting between Albany, where Franklin served as governor beginning in 1929, and Manhattan several days a week specifically, so that she would not have to give up her teaching entirely. A grueling schedule that captured, even at this relatively early stage of her public life, the same relentless refusal to choose between competing commitments that would go on to define nearly every subsequent decade of her remarkable career. She also began writing seriously during this period, publishing articles in women's magazines and eventually a book of her own, building toward the kind of independent public voice and independent income that few women of her wealthy background had ever seriously pursued before her. Income she deliberately kept separate from Franklin's own considerable family fortune, a matter of genuine personal pride for a woman who had spent so many years of her marriage feeling financially and practically dependent on others. Bold statement tone. By the time Franklin decided, in 1928, to run for governor of New York, encouraged strongly by Eleanor herself, along with Louis Howe, both of whom believed his political career needed to resume in earnest rather than remain permanently paused by his physical limitations. Eleanor herself had become a genuinely significant, independently respected figure within New York's Democratic Party. Someone whose own political judgment and organizational skill carried real weight entirely apart from her husband's name. Actively involved in recruiting and training women political organizers across the state, and helping to draft the party's own platform on issues she cared about. Franklin won the governorship, and 4 years later, in the depths of the Great Depression, he won the presidency of the United States itself, defeating the incumbent Herbert Hoover in a landslide driven by the desperate hope of millions of Americans that this confident, energetic man, whatever his own physical limitations, might actually be capable of pulling the country back from the edge of total economic collapse. A collapse that had, by the time of the 1932 election, left roughly a quarter of the entire American workforce without any job at all. Vulnerability tone. As Franklin's inauguration approached in early 1933, Eleanor privately confided to a close friend that she felt genuine dread rather than excitement about the position she was about to occupy. Worried that the largely ceremonial, socially constrained role of First Lady, as it had traditionally been understood, would swallow up entirely the independent professional identity she had spent the previous decades so carefully constructing for herself, a fear rooted in genuine, hard-won experience rather than mere anxiety, since she had watched her own predecessors in the role largely confined to managing White House social functions and offering carefully apolitical public comments. Reflective tone. This fear turned out to be almost entirely unfounded, though not because Eleanor simply accepted the traditional role quietly. Instead, she set about completely redefining what an American First Lady could actually be, informing the nation upon moving into the White House that people should not expect her to be a symbol of elegance and glamour, but rather, in her own deliberately modest phrase, plain, ordinary Mrs. Roosevelt, a phrase that, whatever genuine modesty it conveyed, also functioned as a shrewd piece of public relations, lowering expectations in a way that made her subsequent, genuinely unprecedented activism land as pleasant surprise rather than jarring departure. Bold statement tone. Whatever modesty that phrase implied, what followed over the next 12 years was anything but ordinary. Eleanor became the First Lady in American history to hold her own regular press conferences, a deliberately clever piece of institutional strategy since she opened these sessions exclusively to female reporters, a restriction that forced major news outlets, desperate not to miss access to the president's wife, to hire women journalists they might otherwise never have employed at all. A policy that single-handedly created new professional opportunities for dozens of female reporters across the country's major newspapers during an era when women remained largely excluded from serious political journalism. She held more than 300 of these press conferences across her 12 years in the White House, using them not merely to discuss ceremonial matters, but to advance genuine policy positions, sometimes even pushing back publicly against her own husband's administration when she believed it was moving too slowly or too cautiously on issues she cared about. Holding these sessions in the White House Red Room, which she had personally redesigned specifically to accommodate them. In 1935, she began writing a syndicated newspaper column called My Day, a daily, diary-style account of her activities, her opinions, and her ongoing political concerns, dictated most nights, often as late as 11 or midnight, after an exhausting full day of public engagements, to her devoted longtime secretary, Malvina Thompson, whom everyone called Tommy. Published 6 days a week in dozens and eventually hundreds of newspapers across the country, reaching, by some estimates, an audience of several million readers at its peak. Reflective tone. My Day ran continuously, with only the briefest interruptions, from December of 1935 all the way until Eleanor's own death, nearly 27 years later, making it one of the longest-running and most consistent public records any American public figure has ever produced. A kind of daily, ongoing conversation with the entire country that no First Lady before or since has ever quite managed to replicate. One prominent newspaper editor of the era going so far as to describe the column as required reading for anyone genuinely seeking insight into the administration's actual thinking on the pressing issues of the day. Urgent tone. Because Franklin's polio had left him unable to travel easily or move freely through crowds the way earlier presidents had, Eleanor increasingly took on a role that contemporaries began calling, with genuine accuracy, the president's eyes, ears, and legs. She traveled constantly and extensively throughout the country, visiting New Deal relief projects, coal mining communities in Appalachia, tenant farms in the rural South, and struggling urban neighborhoods hit hardest by the Depression. Once famously descending deep into a working coal mine herself, climbing down in miners' clothing to see conditions firsthand rather than simply relying on second-hand reports. an image that generated considerable newspaper coverage and became, for many Americans, their first real introduction to exactly how differently this new First Lady intended to approach her own public role compared to every predecessor who had come before her. She reported her first-hand observations directly back to her husband, giving him a genuinely grounded, human-level understanding of how his own policies were actually landing in the lives of ordinary Americans that he could never have obtained simply from official government reports filtered up through layers of bureaucracy. Bold statement tone. This role placed Eleanor at the center of some of the most consequential and most controversial fights of the entire New Deal era, since her travels exposed her directly and repeatedly to the brutal realities of American racial segregation. Realities that many white Americans of her own social class had the luxury of simply never confronting. And she championed programs like the National Youth Administration, which created employment and educational opportunities for young Americans left jobless by the collapsing economy, and worked to ensure that relief efforts reached rural and minority communities that more conventional political attention typically overlooked. Reflective tone. Eleanor's civil rights activism, which would eventually become one of the defining features of her entire public life, developed gradually, but with real, mounting conviction throughout her years as First Lady. She joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, cultivated a close personal and political friendship with the educator and civil rights leader Mary McLeod Bethune, the youngest of 17 children born to formerly enslaved parents, who had gone on to found her own college for black students in Florida. A college that began with little more than a handful of students and a rented cottage before growing, over decades of Bethune's own tireless effort, into a genuinely respected institution of higher learning, campaigned actively against the poll taxes that southern states used to disenfranchise black voters, convened a White House conference specifically focused on the needs of black women, and pushed, often with only limited success given her husband's own political need, to preserve support from powerful segregationist Southern Democrats in Congress, for New Deal relief programs to be administered more fairly and inclusively across racial lines. A persistent friction between Eleanor's own moral convictions and Franklin's more cautious political calculations that would recur again and again throughout their partnership. Bold statement tone. The single most famous and most consequential episode of this activism came in 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution, a prestigious patriotic organization of which Eleanor herself was a member, refused to allow the celebrated black contralto Marian Anderson to perform at their own Constitution Hall in Washington, the largest concert venue in the city, citing the organization's own internal policy against integrated performances, a policy that had already quietly barred numerous other black performers from the hall in preceding years, without generating anywhere near the same level of public attention, since Anderson's own extraordinary international reputation as one of the finest voices of her generation made the refusal impossible for the wider public to simply overlook or excuse. Shocking fact tone. Eleanor responded by resigning from the Daughters of the American Revolution publicly and immediately, explaining her decision in her own My Day column with a directness that left absolutely no ambiguity about where she stood, writing that she was resigning because she personally disagreed with the organization's ruling and believed she could do more good by resigning than by remaining a silent member, and then went considerably further, working behind the scenes alongside Secretary of the Interior Harold Ikes to help arrange an alternative venue for Anderson's performance that would prove far more historically resonant than Constitution Hall could ever have been. Mini story tone. Picture the scene that unfolded on Easter Sunday of 1939 when Marian Anderson, denied the concert hall her own talent had more than earned, instead stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and sang before a crowd of 75,000 people gathered on the National Mall, beginning with quiet, deliberate symbolism, with the patriotic anthem, "My Country, 'Tis of Thee," her voice carrying out across the reflecting pool toward the Washington Monument beyond, along with millions more listening on national radio broadcasts, an image of extraordinary, dignified triumph over petty, institutionalized prejudice that became, almost instantly, one of the most powerful and most widely remembered symbols of the entire civil rights movement's long struggle. Decades before that movement would fully coalesce into the form later generations would come to recognize. This entire chain of events, from the initial refusal to Eleanor's public resignation to Anderson's ultimate, transcendent performance, unfolded largely because one woman in an enormously visible public position decided that quiet, polite acquiescence to injustice was simply not something she was willing to offer. Regardless of the social awkwardness her own public protest might cause among women of her own class and background. And though Eleanor herself deliberately did not attend the concert in person, apparently to avoid turning Anderson's own moment of triumph into a spectacle centered on the First Lady rather than the singer, her fingerprints remained unmistakably present across the entire remarkable episode. Reflective tone. It was also during these White House years that Eleanor formed what would become one of the most significant and most enduringly debated relationships of her entire personal life. A close friendship with a talented Associated Press reporter named Lorena Hickok, whom everyone who knew her simply called Hick, a tough, plain-spoken newspaper woman who had clawed her own way up from a genuinely difficult childhood in the Midwest to become, by 1932, the most prominent female reporter in the entire country. Hickok had been assigned to cover Eleanor during Franklin's 1932 presidential campaign, and the two women grew close with a speed and an intensity that surprised even those around them, spending long train journeys together deep in conversation, attending concerts and plays, and eventually developing a friendship so consuming that Hickok herself eventually resigned from her position at the Associated Press. Recognizing that her own professional objectivity as a journalist covering the First Lady had become genuinely compromised by the depth of her personal feelings, going to work instead as chief investigator for a federal relief agency, traveling the country to document the human toll of the Depression in reports that Eleanor herself read closely and drew upon in her own advocacy. The two women exchanged an extraordinary volume of correspondence over the following 3 decades, more than 3,000 letters in total, many of them written daily or even multiple times a day during periods of separation, filled with language of a warmth and an intimacy that has generated considerable historical debate ever since these letters became publicly available in 1978, more than a decade after Hickok's own death, when a researcher combing through boxes of donated papers at the FDR Presidential Library discovered them largely by accident. This could imply, based on the surviving letters themselves, which include passages describing a longing to kiss the corner of Hickok's mouth, and describing Eleanor keeping a photograph of her friend on her desk that she kissed each morning and evening, that the relationship between these two women involved a level of genuine romantic and quite possibly physical intimacy, considerably beyond what conventional friendship between women of that era typically implied, though historians continue to debate the precise nature of that intimacy. Since the surviving correspondence, however emotionally revealing, does not provide the kind of unambiguous documentary proof that would settle the question definitively one way or the other. A genuine ambiguity compounded by the fact that Hickok herself, in her later years, reportedly destroyed a portion of the correspondence, explaining to those who asked that Eleanor had not always been especially discreet in what she chose to commit to paper, a caution that suggests Hickok herself understood the letters contained material considerably more revealing than either woman would have wanted made public during their own lifetimes. Bold statement tone. What can be said with confidence is that Hickok occupied, for a significant stretch of years, a position of genuine emotional centrality in Eleanor's life that few other people, before or after, ever managed to hold, at one point living for extended periods inside the White House itself, in a bedroom located directly across the hall from Eleanor's own, an arrangement that the entire Roosevelt household simply came to accept as a normal feature of their daily domestic life, Eleanor even wearing a sapphire ring Hickok had given her on the very day of Franklin's first presidential inauguration in 1933. Urgent tone. As the 1930s gave way to the far more dangerous decade that followed, Eleanor's public role expanded once again to meet the demands of a nation preparing, and then fighting, a genuinely global war. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 and America's subsequent entry into the Second World War, Eleanor served briefly as Assistant Director of Civilian Defense, organizing volunteer networks across the country and overseeing programs meant to prepare American cities for the possibility of enemy attack. Though she resigned from this specific administrative position after only a year following considerable political criticism over some of her own more controversial staffing choices, including appointments of friends and associates that congressional critics seized upon as evidence of nepotism and poor judgment. A decision that reflected Eleanor's own consistent lifelong habit of extending genuine trust to those who worked closely alongside her, even when that trust occasionally exposed her to exactly the kind of public criticism this particular episode generated. Reflective tone. Eleanor's own position on one of the war's most morally fraught domestic policies remains a genuinely complicated part of her legacy. When her husband signed Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, authorizing the forced removal and internment of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans, the overwhelming majority of them American citizens, into remote camps scattered across the western interior of the country. Eleanor privately expressed real reservations about the policy, reportedly urging her husband, without ultimate success, to reconsider the sweeping scope of the order, and would later, in the years after the war ended, speak and write more openly in defense of the civil liberties these Japanese American families had been so unjustly denied. Even visiting one of the internment camps personally in 1943, and writing candidly afterward about the injustice she had witnessed there, though she did not, at the time the policy was actually being implemented, mount the kind of forceful public opposition to her own husband's decision that her later, better documented civil rights advocacy elsewhere might otherwise lead observers to expect. A gap between her private misgivings and her public silence that historians studying this period have continued to examine and debate. Bold statement tone. Eleanor's wartime travels carried her, quite literally, to the front lines of the conflict itself. She traveled to England in 1942 to visit American servicemen stationed there, and to observe firsthand the devastating effects the German bombing campaign had already inflicted on British cities. Touring bomb shelters and meeting with Queen Elizabeth and other British officials to coordinate wartime cooperation between the two allied nations. Her visit generating enormous positive press coverage on both sides of the Atlantic, and helping to strengthen the wartime bond between the American and British publics at a genuinely critical moment in the conflict, and in 1943, in a journey that made her the first First Lady in American history to travel into an active war zone. She embarked on a grueling month-long tour of military hospitals and bases scattered across the South Pacific, covering more than 25,000 miles by military aircraft under conditions of genuine physical hardship and real danger. Since Japanese submarines and aircraft still posed a credible threat throughout much of the region she was visiting, walking miles of hospital corridors, sitting personally with wounded and dying servicemen, taking down messages to relay to worried families back home, and, according to observers who accompanied her, holding up bottles of blood plasma herself during transfusions when medical staff were short-handed, a pace of activity that reportedly left even hardened military commanders accompanying her genuinely exhausted trying to keep up with her. Woman by then in her late 50s, one admiral reportedly remarking afterward that he had never in his entire career encountered a civilian visitor capable of sustaining such a relentless schedule. Reflective tone. Historians studying this period have specifically noted the bitter irony Eleanor herself could hardly have failed to register during these hospital visits, since the American military she was touring remained rigidly segregated even as it fought a war explicitly framed, in propaganda and public rhetoric alike, as a struggle against a racist enemy ideology. Black and white American soldiers treated in separate wards, given separated blood supplies, despite there being no genuine medical basis whatsoever for the distinction. Fighting under the same flag, but denied the same basic dignity within their own country's own military institutions. A contradiction Eleanor would return to explicitly in her own post-war writing and advocacy, once she was no longer bound by the political constraints of directly representing her husband's wartime administration. Vulnerability tone. And then, on the 12th of April, in the year 1945, less than 3 months after being sworn in for an unprecedented fourth presidential term, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died suddenly of a massive cerebral hemorrhage at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, while sitting for a portrait painting, complaining of a sudden, terrific headache moments before he collapsed. Urgent tone. Eleanor received the devastating news by telephone while attending a public event in Washington, and immediately flew south to Georgia, where she learned in the raw, disorienting hours immediately following her husband's death, a detail that would compound her grief with a fresh, painful betrayal. Lucy Mercer Rutherford, the very woman whose love letters Eleanor had discovered in 1918, and whom Franklin had explicitly promised, all those decades earlier, never to see again, had in fact been present at Warm Springs at the moment of his death, having resumed contact with Franklin years earlier following the death of her own husband in 1944. Meetings that Eleanor's own daughter Anna had helped quietly arrange without her mother's knowledge, believing, according to her own later account, that these visits offered her exhausted, dying father a measure of light-hearted companionship he badly needed during the crushing final pressures of leading the nation through the war's final months. A decision Anna made with genuine, if ultimately painful, filial devotion rather than any intention to deceive her own mother. Shocking fact tone. Eleanor learned, in other words, in the same devastating hours in which she learned of her husband's death, that the promise she had extracted from him decades earlier, the one condition she had insisted upon in exchange for preserving their marriage rather than pursuing a divorce, had in fact been broken, and had been broken with the quiet cooperation of her own daughter, a discovery so painful that Eleanor's relationship with Anna reportedly remained genuinely strained for a considerable period afterward. A rupture in an otherwise close mother-daughter bond that would take real time and effort from both women to eventually, at least partially, repair. Anna herself later recalling the guilt she carried over having kept the secret from a mother she otherwise deeply respected and loved. Reflective tone. Eleanor, Whatever private anguish this discovery caused her, chose, with characteristic discipline, not to allow it to become public knowledge or to disrupt the dignity of her husband's funeral and the nation's collective mourning. Maintaining a public composure that historians studying her private correspondence from this period recognize as having concealed a considerably more complicated and painful private reality, one she processed largely alone during the exhausting days of official mourning that followed, greeting foreign dignitaries and accepting condolences from a grieving nation even as she carried this fresh, private wound almost entirely unshared. When asked in the immediate aftermath what she planned to do next with her own life, Eleanor famously remarked, with a bluntness that captured both her genuine grief and her characteristic refusal toward self-pity, that the story was over, a phrase that suggested, at least in that raw initial moment, that she believed her own public relevance had been entirely tied to her husband's now concluded presidency. A moment of genuine, understandable uncertainty from a 60-year-old widow suddenly facing the prospect of an entirely new and unscripted chapter of her own life. One for which nothing in her previous decades of public service, however extraordinary, had quite prepared her to anticipate. Bold statement tone. Nothing could have been further from what actually happened next. Rather than retreating quietly into private widowhood at her beloved Valkill cottage, Eleanor Roosevelt was about to begin the final, and in her own later assessment the single most consequential chapter of her entire extraordinary public life. Urgent tone. Only months after Franklin's death, the newly installed President Harry Truman approached Eleanor with an offer that would have seemed, to almost anyone who had followed her recent remark about her own story being over, entirely unexpected. An appointment as one of the first American delegates to the newly established United Nations General Assembly, an institution still being constructed from scratch in the immediate, hopeful aftermath of a war that had left much of the world in ruins. Vulnerability tone. Eleanor's initial reaction was genuine hesitation rather than eager acceptance. She had no formal legal training, no direct diplomatic experience, and she confided to friends that she felt entirely unqualified for a role of this magnitude on the world stage, telling Truman honestly that she was unsure she could contribute anything of real value, particularly given that she had also, only recently, turned down several other prominent offers, including a possible run for the United States Senate and the leadership of a major university apparently uncertain, in these first disorienting months of widowhood, about what shape her own continued public life might actually take. Reflective tone. By the end of that very same day, however, she had changed her mind and accepted the appointment, becoming the only woman among the entire American delegation to this brand new international body. A body created in the direct aftermath of a war that had killed tens of millions of people, and that carried, in the hopeful language of its own founding charter, genuine ambitions to prevent any such catastrophe from ever happening again. Bold statement tone. Eleanor quickly discovered, once she actually arrived at the United Nations, that her male colleagues had deliberately assigned her to what they considered a comparatively minor committee dealing with social, humanitarian, and cultural matters, a placement several of them privately admitted was intended specifically to keep the president's famous but inexperienced widow safely away from the more prestigious, more consequential committees handling security and economic questions, some of her fellow delegates reportedly describing her, in private, using words like strident and schoolmarmish, a dismissive characterization that would look considerably less credible within only a few short years. This strategy of quiet containment failed almost immediately and almost completely. Within her very first year at the United Nations, Eleanor was elected chairperson of the newly formed Commission on Human Rights, and it was in this specific role, considered by many of her own male colleagues a relatively obscure administrative assignment when it was first created, that Eleanor Roosevelt would go on to accomplish what she herself would later describe, without exaggeration, as the single greatest achievement of her entire life, a body composed of 18 members drawn deliberately from a wide range of political, cultural, and religious backgrounds specifically, so that whatever document eventually emerged might carry genuine claim to universal legitimacy, rather than reflecting merely one civilization's particular values, an ambition that required Eleanor, week after week, to find genuine common ground among men who frequently agreed on almost nothing else regarding how a just and well-ordered society ought to actually be structured. Reflective tone. The task facing Eleanor's commission was, on its face, almost impossibly ambitious, drafting a document that could articulate, in language acceptable to nations with wildly different political systems, religious traditions, and cultural values, a genuinely universal statement of the basic rights every single human being on Earth was entitled to simply by virtue of being human. A task complicated further by the fact that the world had, quite literally, never before attempted to reach this kind of genuinely global agreement on what human dignity actually required. Every previous declaration of rights in human history, having emerged from within a single nation or a single cultural tradition, rather than claiming universal application across the entire species. The Commission's core drafting group included representatives from China, Lebanon, France, the Soviet Union, and several other nations, men whose own philosophical and political starting points diverged dramatically from one another and from Eleanor's own American liberal tradition, forcing every single proposed article through a genuinely exhausting process of translation, negotiation, and compromise before it could even be considered for the final text. Mini-story tone. Picture the scene inside these drafting sessions, sometimes running late into the night across more than 80 separate working meetings. The Chinese delegate, Peng Chun-chang, a philosopher and diplomat steeped in Confucian tradition, gently pushing back against what he considered the overly narrow Western framing being proposed by his colleagues, at one point suggesting, with evident good humor, that the entire drafting committee might benefit from spending several months simply studying the fundamentals of Confucian philosophy before proceeding any further, while the Lebanese delegate, Charles Malik, a philosopher trained in the Western tradition of Thomas Aquinas, offered his own passionate counter-arguments rooted in natural law theory, launching into lengthy expositions of Thomistic philosophy that occasionally left the rest of the room politely, patiently waiting for him to finish, and the Soviet delegation pressed, again and again, for language emphasizing collective economic rights over the kind of individual civil liberties the American and Western European delegations considered non-negotiable, a fundamental philosophical divide that would eventually prevent the Soviet bloc from ever formally endorsing the completed document at all. Bold statement tone. Eleanor's genuine achievement here, in the eyes of most historians who have studied this fractious, exhausting process closely, lay not merely in the eventual text itself, but in the sheer, sustained diplomatic patience required to hold such a genuinely divided commission together across nearly 2 full years of difficult, often bad-tempered negotiation without ever once allowing the entire project to simply collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Bold statement tone. Eleanor Roosevelt, chairing this extraordinary and genuinely fractious gathering of some of the era's most formidable legal and philosophical minds, brought to the role not expert legal credentials, which she readily admitted she lacked, but rather the practical skills of a lifetime spent as a political organizer, a reformer, and an advocate for people whose voices power structures habitually ignored, an understanding of freedom and human dignity forged not in law school seminar rooms but in New York tenement classrooms, Appalachian coal towns, and segregated military hospitals scattered across the Pacific. Urgent tone. As the drafting process stretched deep into 1948, with the Cold War rapidly hardening into open hostility between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies, following the Soviet blockade of Berlin and mounting political crises across Europe and Asia that seemed to threaten the entire post-war international order, Eleanor grew genuinely, privately worried that the entire project might collapse entirely. Telling her own readers in My Day of her mounting frustration with what she described as deliberate Soviet delaying tactics designed to prevent the declaration from ever reaching a final vote, writing with a bluntness rare for her column that she could admire persistence for its own sake if it were not so often deployed simply to obstruct, rather than genuinely improve the text under discussion. Responding to pressure from President Truman and his Secretary of State George Marshall to help launch what amounted to a moral offensive against Soviet obstruction, Eleanor traveled to Paris in September of 1948 to deliver a major address at the Sorbonne, titled The Struggle for Human Rights, delivered partly in French, a language she had first mastered decades earlier under Marie Souvestre's own patient tutelage at Allenswood, a speech that helped rally renewed international momentum behind the flagging drafting process during its most precarious final months. Reflective tone. The final vote finally came on the 10th of December in the year 1948 at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, after Eleanor had personally chaired more than 3,000 hours of contentious deliberation stretching back across nearly 2 full years. A workload so demanding that a State Department aide who observed her during this period later recalled her negotiating tirelessly right up until the final vote, as though driven, in his own words, by some inner compulsion that would never let her come to rest. Bold statement tone. At 3 o'clock in the morning, following one final exhausting session of debate, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document of 30 carefully negotiated articles affirming, for the first time in the history of international law, that every single human being on Earth possessed certain basic, inalienable rights simply by virtue of being born. Rights to life, to liberty, to freedom from torture and slavery, to education, to work, to a fair trial, to freedom of thought and conscience and religion. Rights that no government, however powerful, could legitimately strip away from its own citizens. Of the 58 member nations of the United Nations at the time, 48 voted in favor, none voted against, and 8 nations, including the entire Soviet bloc, along with Saudi Arabia and South Africa, chose to abstain rather than vote either for or against a document whose implications for their own internal governance they found genuinely uncomfortable. Saudi Arabia objecting specifically to provisions concerning religious freedom and equal marriage rights that conflicted with its own interpretation of Islamic law, and South Africa objecting to language on racial equality that stood in direct, obvious tension with its own emerging system of apartheid. Shocking fact tone. When the vote was finally announced, the assembled delegates rose to their feet and gave Eleanor Roosevelt a spontaneous, sustained standing ovation, an extraordinary tribute from a body of hardened international diplomats not typically inclined towards such open displays of personal admiration, recognizing, in that single moment, the singular role this one woman had played in bringing a genuinely unprecedented document into existence against odds that had, for much of the preceding 2 years, appeared genuinely insurmountable. a moment of collective, spontaneous emotion so at odds with the usually staid procedural atmosphere of United Nations proceedings that several observers present that night specifically remarked upon it in their own subsequent accounts. Reflective tone. Eleanor herself, addressing the Assembly shortly before the vote, described the document using language that has itself become historically significant, calling it a Magna Carta for all mankind. An intentional echo of the foundational medieval English document that had first established the principle that even kings were bound by law, now extended, in Eleanor's own formulation, to the entire human family rather than merely to the subjects of a single kingdom, a comparison she had clearly chosen with care, understanding that ordinary listeners across dozens of different nations and cultures would immediately grasp its significance even without any specialized legal training. This could imply, based on how deliberately Eleanor chose this particular historical comparison, that she understood with real clarity exactly how consequential and how historically unprecedented an achievement the Declaration actually represented, even as contemporary critics, including the respected legal scholar Hirsch Lauterpacht, dismissed the document at the time as largely symbolic and legally unenforceable, lacking any genuine mechanism to compel governments that violated its principles to actually change their behavior, a criticism grounded in genuine legal reality, since the Declaration, unlike a formal treaty, carried no binding enforcement power whatsoever under international law as it then existed. History has, in the more than 7 decades since, largely vindicated Eleanor's own optimism rather than her critics' skepticism, the Universal Declaration going on to serve as the foundational reference point for dozens of national constitutions and international human rights treaties adopted across the entire subsequent history of the post-war world, its 30 articles still cited today, more consistently than any comparable document. Whenever international bodies attempt to articulate exactly what basic human dignity actually requires, a document translated eventually into more languages than any other text in human history apart from religious scripture, printed on posters, taught in schoolrooms, and invoked by human rights defenders and dissidents in nations across every continent on Earth, many of them living under governments that had never formally ratified the very document those citizens nonetheless continued to invoke in their own defense. Bold statement tone. Eleanor continued serving as an American delegate to the United Nations until 1952, when the election of the Republican Dwight Eisenhower to the presidency led her, following long-standing diplomatic convention regarding delegate appointments tied to the outgoing administration, to resign her official position, though she remained deeply involved with United Nations-related causes through private organizations for years afterward, serving actively with the American Association for the United Nations, and continuing to advocate publicly for the human rights, principles she had spent years helping to codify. Reflective tone. Even out of official government service, Eleanor's public influence scarcely diminished. She continued writing her My Day column, continued publishing books, including several volumes of memoir that would eventually be collected into a widely read autobiography, and remained a genuinely influential voice within the Democratic Party, courted by successive presidential candidates who understood exactly how much moral authority and organizational skill she still commanded among the party's most engaged voters, even as she moved deeper into what most people would ordinarily consider the retirement years of old age, hosting her own television and radio programs during this period and remaining, by nearly every measure available to pollsters of the era, one of the most recognized and most trusted women in the entire country. Urgent tone. In 1960, though she had initially supported a different candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, favoring the more experienced Adlai Stevenson, whom she had grown to trust over years of collaboration. Eleanor met personally with the eventual nominee, a young senator named John F. Kennedy, at her own Valkill cottage, and came away sufficiently reassured about his genuine commitment to progressive governance and his stated intention to work closely with Stevenson that she began actively campaigning on his behalf during the general election, lending her still considerable political credibility to a candidate many older guard Democrats had initially viewed with real suspicion. Bold statement tone. Once elected, Kennedy, understanding precisely how much continued value Eleanor's public involvement still carried even in her mid-70s, reappointed her to a renewed role at the United Nations and additionally named her the founding chairperson of his newly established Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, tasking her with leading a comprehensive national examination of exactly what genuine equality for American women would actually require, covering everything from employment discrimination to childcare access to unequal pay, a project that would eventually help lay important groundwork for the more sweeping feminist legislative and legal reforms of the following decade, work Eleanor herself would not live to see fully realized, though the Commission's eventual 1963 report would go on to directly influence landmark legislation passed only months after her own death. Vulnerability tone. By this point, however, Eleanor's own physical health, remarkably robust for most of her adult life, despite the relentless pace of activity she had always maintained, had begun to fail in earnest. In April of 1960, following a minor car accident in New York City, doctors discovered that Eleanor was suffering from a serious blood disorder that would eventually be diagnosed, though imperfectly given the medical understanding available at the time, as aplastic anemia, a condition in which the bone marrow gradually loses its ability to produce sufficient new blood cells. Her personal physician warning her frankly that transfusions might offer temporary relief, but that her condition would, sooner or later, prove fatal. Reflective tone. Eleanor's own initial response to this diagnosis captured, with almost painful precision, the exact character trait that had defined her entire adult life, telling her doctor simply that she was too busy to be sick, and continuing, for as long as her body would physically allow it, to maintain something close to her ordinary punishing schedule of writing, travel, and public engagement, still touring struggling American communities, still writing her daily column, still speaking publicly on behalf of causes she cared about, refusing to allow even a genuinely serious diagnosis to slow the pace of a life she had spent nearly 4 decades deliberately, defiantly refusing to live quietly. Urgent tone. Over the following 2 years, Eleanor's condition steadily worsened, complicated by treatments that, with the medical knowledge available in the early 1960s, sometimes did more harm than genuine good, repeated blood transfusions that occasionally triggered severe transfusion reactions and fevers as high as 105 degrees Fahrenheit. High doses of steroid medication that eventually activated a dormant tuberculosis infection quietly lingering in her body since a serious bout of pleurisy she had suffered decades earlier, at only 35 years old, in 1919, an infection that had never been fully diagnosed or treated at the time, and that now, reactivated by her weakened immune system, spread silently through several of her internal organs without producing the telltale lung symptoms doctors would normally have expected, delaying an accurate diagnosis until the infection had already advanced far beyond any realistic hope of treatment. By the autumn of 1962, Eleanor was hospitalized repeatedly, suffering from high fevers, night sweats severe enough that she often needed her bedding changed multiple times in a single night, severe anemia, and a wasting, drug-resistant infection. Her doctors, working with the diagnostic tools available to them at the time, struggled to properly identify and treat until it was already far too late to reverse its course. The bacterial cultures needed to definitively confirm tuberculosis, taking a painfully slow 6 weeks to develop using the laboratory technology available in that era. Vulnerability tone. Even in these final, physically diminished months, Eleanor reportedly expressed to those close to her a clear-eyed wish that aggressive medical intervention simply be allowed to stop. A request her physicians, operating within the far more paternalistic medical culture of that era, did not fully honor. Continuing treatments and interventions that modern medical ethics, with its far greater emphasis on patient autonomy and end-of-life wishes, would very likely have handled quite differently. Continuing transfusions and other invasive procedures that, in the professional judgment of at least one physician who later reviewed the case, offered her patient little genuine benefit while adding considerably to her suffering during those final difficult weeks. On the 7th of November, in the year 1962, Eleanor Roosevelt died at her home in Manhattan, cared for in her final hours by her daughter Anna, succumbing at the age of 78 to the combined effects of tuberculosis, aplastic anemia, and the heart failure that finally, mercifully, brought her long final illness to its end. Bold statement tone. President John F. Kennedy ordered every American flag around the entire world lowered to half-staff in her honor, and her funeral, held 2 days later at the family estate in Hyde Park, drew an extraordinary gathering of American political power spanning multiple presidential administrations. President Kennedy himself, in attendance alongside Vice President Lyndon Johnson and former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, along with countless ordinary Americans who had, over the preceding 3 decades, come to feel that this remarkable woman belonged, in some genuine sense, to all of them rather than merely to her own famous family, many of them traveling considerable distances simply to stand somewhere near the estate grounds as the funeral procession passed. Unable to attend the service itself, but unwilling to let the moment go, unmarked entirely. A rector from the local Episcopal church read the burial service. 3 ceremonial volleys were fired over her grave, and taps sounded across the rose garden as her casket was finally lowered into the ground. She was buried in the rose garden at the Roosevelt family's Springwood estate, laid to rest beside the husband whose own presidency she had so profoundly shaped, and whose legacy she had gone on, after his death, to extend and transform into something even larger and even more consequential than either of them could likely have imagined on that devastating night in 1918 when a young, insecure political wife first discovered a packet of another woman's love letters tucked inside her husband's luggage. Reflective tone. It is worth pausing, at the very end of this remarkable story, to consider the full arc of the journey that carried Eleanor Roosevelt from that lonely, unwanted little girl standing at the top of a grand staircase, absorbing her own mother's casual cruelty, to the woman whose signature stands at the head of the single most influential human rights document the modern world has ever produced. A journey spanning more than 3/4 of a century and touching, in one way or another, nearly every one of the great political and social transformations of the entire 20th century. Bold statement tone. Nothing about that transformation was inevitable. Nothing about it was handed to her simply by virtue of her family's famous name or her considerable inherited wealth, resources that, on their own, had produced plenty of other Roosevelts and Halls who lived out comparatively unremarkable, socially conventional lives entirely within the narrow expectations of their class. Wealthy men and women whose names have long since faded from public memory precisely because they never chose to risk their own comfort and social standing the way Eleanor so consistently did. What actually carried Eleanor from private pain into genuine world-shaping public consequence was a combination of relentless personal discipline, a genuine and deepening moral seriousness about the suffering of people considerably less fortunate than herself, and an almost unbreakable willingness to keep working, keep showing up, and keep insisting on being heard, even when the people around her, including at times her own husband, would have found it considerably more convenient for her to simply stay quiet. Reflective tone. She spent her entire adult life proving, through sustained action rather than mere assertion, that the deepest wounds of childhood do not have to become the final, defining word of an entire human life. That a woman once told, quite literally to her face, that she was too plain and too serious to ever truly matter, could grow instead into the very conscience of an entire nation. And, for a few remarkable years at the exact center of the 20th century, into something genuinely resembling the conscience of the wider world itself. A woman who took the specific, private pain of a mother's cold disappointment, a father's tragic addiction, and a husband's betrayal, and transformed all of it, deliberately and with tremendous effort, into a lifelong expansive empathy for millions of strangers whose own suffering she never personally experienced. But somehow, through sheer force of attention and moral seriousness, always managed to genuinely understand. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight, walking through the extraordinary, deeply human journey of the girl who became the world's first lady. If her story moved you, let me know in the comments which part of her life you found most inspiring, and I will see you in the next one.